Thank you everyone for attending today. I'm really pleased to see such a diverse community. I think Michael, myself and Will were really pleased to see that we've got great representation from universities, government, academia, industry and indeed the third sector. So that's absolutely fantastic. And I think particularly we'd like to thank the OR Society for supporting these roadshow events, and I'll explain a little bit more about what that entails shortly. But basically today we're here to talk about AI assurance and some of the challenges in terms of procurement in that context. So I think it's going to be quite a lively debate. What we'd really like to delve into is the types of responsibilities for the customer and the supplier, and also how those two parties can work together for better outcomes for their customers as well. Validate AI was launched in 2019, November, at the Royal Society, and is actually created through a conversation with myself, academics from Oxford University and Imperial College, and we were really quite concerned about how AI systems were. I guess we were happy about the democratization of AI and the ease of access, but we were concerned about how well systems were being validated and were being deployed. So we had this launch event and we had some absolutely fantastic speakers there from industry and the likes of DeepMind, Twitter, various kind of leading academics in the field. And since then, we've had various gatherings, workshops, community events. So Validate AI is very much about bringing different people together who are interested in ensuring that what we deliver is safe, trustworthy and responsible. And thank you all for attending today's event. So what do we do at Validate AI? Effectively, there's three aspects to it. One is to basically promote best practice, look at what standards are out there, probe those standards, and see whether we can do better. So that's where the innovation aspect comes into it. And importantly, we're not claiming as Validate AI that we have the answer. So we're very much about convening the community to really problem solve. And today, it'd be fantastic to get your views in this particular context. And the three kind of aspects or tenets of Validate AI, we want to make sure that our AI is relevant, it's basically robust, technically robust and ethically aligned to our communities. And why are we doing this? We're doing this to manage the variety of significant risks. Those risks may manifest themselves in terms of financial, reputational, indeed some of the generative AI technology, you could question whether it's having massive psychological ramifications on humans as well. So we really need to manage these significant risks. And as one of my colleagues at Imperial College describes, the elevator is on ground level and there's a lot yet to come. So the workshop will be probing into some pillars of AI assurance, and I'll explain when we get to the actual exercise what I mean by that. But some of the challenges we have are around whether the AI is properly formulated. Is it actually doing what we want it to do? Is it free of bugs? Is the data representative? And on a foundation level, is it ethically sound? So these are some of the issues we'll be probing in the workshop and indeed in the panel session. And I think, this is very much very topical at the moment, not least because there's this AI summit coming up in November, supported by the Prime Minister. Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation have been doing some excellent work around AI assurance and creating an ecosystem. We've got Nuala here from CDEI today. It'd be great to hear more about what's going on at CDEI. But we're very much big advocates of the concept of AI assurance and certification. So more about that in the coming hours. So as I say, this event, this workshop, is basically the launch of the roadshow, and the roadshow is being hosted by various universities and learned societies. So the next one lined up is at Imperial College, and we've got an event, I believe Anastasia is here today. They'll be running a health AI assurance workshop in November, and there's another one at Vienna, etc. I'll explain towards the end of this workshop what's going on where. And these various deep dives, these various workshops are delving into different aspects of assurance. Some of the universities are looking at sectors, others are looking at particular problem, be it generative AI, procurement today, it could be the intersect of operational research and AI. But the plan is at the end of 2024, we bring together the learning from all these different universities to showcase the key outputs from the various workshops. So just very quickly, what's the key goals of the workshop today? I think importantly it's about encouraging this conversation, both at the panel and the interactive workshop session. And importantly, probing into some of the commercial, legal, data, analytical challenges that we are confronted with as a community. And ideally, what we'd like to do is, through the outputs of the workshop through Slido, and in the coming weeks, develop an initial framework about what AI procurement assurance would look like, and really trying to understand what the relationship between the supplier and the customer is in terms of delivering on this major task. And indeed, hopefully through lunch, probing through how we can take some of the learning back to our workplaces as well. So thank you once again for attending today, and really looking forward to your comments and feedback. I hand over to Michael now. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael Rovatsos. I'm a professor of AI at the School of Informatics, just next door, and until a few weeks ago, I was director of this center, the Base Center, which is hosting us today, and which is the university's innovation hub for data science and AI. We're very pleased to have this workshop today here at the university and at the Base Center, and with support from the Base Center and the Scottish AI Alliance and the School of Informatics. And this is a university that was amongst the pioneers in AI 60 years ago, one of the first places that did AI research. We're of course very deeply engaged in conversations around AI safety, trustworthy AI, AI ethics. So we have, for example, a major program in trustworthy autonomous systems and their governance and regulation, projects around responsibility in autonomous systems. We have a big data and AI ethics center at the Edinburgh Futures Institute, and many other initiatives. Not least, I think also it's important, many people don't know this, that this university is kind of pretty much the birthplace of this area called science and technology studies in at least the UK and Europe. Many years ago, people started thinking about what happens when we actually start having these socio-technical systems where technology is embedded in a social context, and I think that's what we're seeing happening with AI more and more now. Today's workshop, as Shakeel highlighted, is very much about the practicalities of what that means when organizations are thinking of using AI, deploying AI in their own internal business processes or in their customer client-facing services. And what we can do right now in terms of assurance and where people should be looking, what the capabilities are and skills that they need to draw upon, rather than the many conversations about kind of technical nuts and bolts of how do we do testing and so on. Of course, these two things interact, because what's technically possible will determine what organizations do. But we wanted to really convene a broad range of people from the public, private, and academic sector to think about what should the obligations on clients be, what should the obligations on suppliers be, what contractual frameworks do we need to put in place, and most importantly, how much of that is something that we already know how to do, and how much of it changes with the introduction of AI, and in fact also to question that, challenge that, and think about whether there are many things that are indeed similar in other areas of digital and IT, and maybe AI is just a new technology that makes us think more about them because of the new potential risks and harms that we're seeing. So to kick us off, there will be a lot of opportunity to do work in the tables and different groups, and we're really going to rely quite a lot on your input and your perspectives. But to kick us off, we'll start with the panel discussion. Sharon Moore is IBM's Global CTO for Government, and she helps transform public service through the ethical application of technology in order to drive change for good in the tech industry and in the impact it has on society. She has over 20 years of experience in outsourcing, sales, consulting, has worked in many sectors and with many diverse technologies. She's very passionate about change and inclusion. She's worked a lot with BCS Women and also formerly through Scotland Women in Technology. And for that work and her other contributions, she was awarded MBE at the Queen's Birthday Honours in 2018. She was recently listed in the Computing IT Leaders 100 for 2022 and Computer Weekly Most Influential Women in the UK Tech Hall of Fame, as she had been included in this top 50 since 2018, which I think is very, very impressive. Thank you, Sharon, for joining us. Nuala Polo is a senior policy advisor and the AI assurance lead at the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation, which now sits with the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. She works on exploring the role of tools for trustworthy AI, assurance techniques and standards to manage risks, build trust, and also around AI governance. She's the lead author of the CDI's Industry Temperature Check report, which identified the industry barriers to engage with tools and trustworthy AI in areas such as HR recruitment, finance, connected and automated vehicles. Very happy to say Nuala is a graduate of this university, where she did her master's in cognition in science and society. Previously she studied in some other places, lots of other things, like history of science and technology, philosophy and mathematics. Before moving to CDI, I'm also very pleased to say she worked as a consultant for AI ethics consultancy Ethical Intelligence, which I'm sure some of the Edinburgh colleagues will remember as a venture that started at this university and has grown since. Thanks, Nuala, for being with us today. And next I'm going to turn to Tom. Tom Wilkinson is Chief Data Officer at the Scottish Government. He has extensive experience working across data science, data analysis, data architecture, software development, data engineering. He started his career as an operational researcher. He moved then to the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office and was their head of management information and analytics. And among other things there, he helped introduce self-service data and established the ONS Data Science Hub in East Kilbride. For those of you who think that all this interesting stuff happens down south, it does not. Tom holds a PhD in complexity science. He's really complexity economics and the philosophy of statistics, sorry. And so he's very interested in complex systems, and I'm sure he's also studying the AI ecosystem from that, through that lens. He's passionate about helping the Scottish Government realize the potential of its data, a big challenge for all governments, I'm sure, and is working with a lot of government departments in trying to achieve that. Thanks, Tom, for joining us today. And finally, last but not least, Rob Claxton is Senior Manager in Data and AI at BT, where he currently leads the AI Futures Research Group. He's worked in a variety of technology roles in his 30 years at BT. That spanned everything from signaling systems and the development of BT's intelligent network platform through to things like network science. He played a key role in BT's adoption of big data technology, and his team are now actively applying machine learning and AI to real-world problems. including natural language processing and machine vision. Rob has worked a lot on issues around safe and effective use of these technologies. He leads an AI governance project at the TM Forum, which is kind of an organization that tries to introduce practical assets for standardization and assurance in the telco industry. And he graduated from the University of York in 1993 in electronic systems engineering. So that makes us roughly as long in the business. And it's interesting how things have changed over that period. Thanks, Rob, for joining us. So I want to start with a round of questions for each of you that focus a bit on broad issues around AI assurance and basically the current state of play. What are the capabilities we already have? What's the maturity of the assurance ecosystem? And what do you think are priorities and gaps we should be looking at? And I'm just looking for the microphone, which is, oh, that's great, covers everyone. So I want to start with Nuala. So at the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation, you've done a lot of work to develop guidance for AI assurance. Recently, you've put together a portfolio of assurance techniques together to support anybody involved in designing, deploying, and procuring AI-enabled systems. So, given what you've seen and based on your knowledge of the current AI assurance ecosystem, how mature do you think these techniques are at the moment, and where do you see the big gaps?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think before I talk about the techniques themselves, especially because this is maybe the first answer, just to give a bit of kind of context of what we're talking about when we talk about AI assurance at CDI. So for us, assurance is kind of measuring, evaluating, and communicating something about a system. And in the context of AI, it's really looking at trying to measure and evaluate the trustworthiness of that system. Trustworthy is obviously quite a nebulous concept, but right now we're kind of thinking of that in terms of the Office for AI's proposed regulatory principles. So is a system fair, transparent, explainable, etc. And there's a range of different techniques that currently exist that can be used to kind of assess systems. So we have more qualitative techniques like impact assessment, impact evaluation, etc. And then we have kind of more formal and quantitative techniques like audit, conformity assessment, and the future maybe certification. There's kind of this range of techniques that exists. And we wanted to do a little bit of work to understand what are the techniques that people can actually kind of go out and start using today. And as you mentioned, we put together this portfolio of assurance techniques, which is kind of a series of use cases, particularly targeted to startups and SMEs who said, we want to assure our systems, but we have no idea what that looks like. We don't know what an impact assessment is. We wouldn't know where to find one, etc. So having this kind of portfolio of use cases we thought would be a good starting point to show what some companies are doing in this space, what you can kind of look to, and also look at how those techniques are applied in a particular context rather than just kind of reading about them in theory. But that being said, I would say the maturity of the ecosystem, it's still really nascent. So we have this portfolio, we want to show what's happening, but the first iteration had maybe kind of 15 case studies, and we'll be updating it every 3 months. I think in this iteration we expect to have maybe 15 more. So it's growing, but it's still quite small. And I would say the maturity is also a reflection of kind of wider infrastructure. So if we look at the maturity of things like standards and professionalization, and so standards is something we're looking at a lot to support assurance. And when I talk about standards, I'm talking about kind of technical SDO developed standards, so by ISO, IEEE, IEC. And we think that these are so important to underpin the techniques, because if you're going to be evaluating a system, like let's say evaluating bias, performing a bias audit, you need some kind of consistent methods, some metrics, some thresholds of acceptability, and standards can provide that kind of industry accepted best practice. And without that, like I can audit a system, you can audit a system, Michael can audit a system, we can all do it in completely different ways, we can all come up with completely different outcomes, and you don't really know who to trust. There's not a lot of coherence across the service providers. So we think until that kind of standard landscape evolves, it's really, really difficult to have a mature assurance landscape. And there's a lot of work being done. So standards, there's maybe a handful that have been published, but there's lots in development. And so I would say that's something we're really looking forward to, particularly around ISO IEC 42001, which will be an AI management system standard that we think will help organizations to kind of get those management systems in place that will help to support responsible innovation. So short answer, still quite nascent, not that mature. And then to answer the gaps point, I think one thing that we're seeing in the techniques that exist is that there's a pretty strong technical focus. So we're looking at evaluating kind of the technical rather than, as you say, the socio-technical aspects of a system, which at CDI we think is definitely a gap. So for example, when we look at a bias audit, you're looking at kind of evaluating statistical notions of bias, and that's being used to measure fairness, but we think fairness is a much richer concept than just kind of evaluating bias in a system. So this is my one plug for the day. We are launching a Fairness Innovation Challenge in the next couple of months, which will be a grant challenge. And this will ask organizations to develop solutions that address fairness, looking at bias and discrimination, but kind of wider socio-technical aspects of fairness in AI systems. So we want to look at audit, but we also want to look at kind of participatory data collection, audit and mitigation techniques, custom and context-specific metrics, and wider governance interventions. So that's a gap that I think we're really looking to fill and make sure that there's that kind of interdisciplinary input.
So I guess what that also means is that technical capabilities are advancing.
They're advancing faster than I would say anything else, and that's where a lot of the work and focus is being done. I think because it's more quantitative and it feels a little bit easier and more tangible. You know, how do you define fairness in order to start measuring it? That's a really difficult challenge. So focusing on, as I say, kind of statistical notions is easier, but we think it's really important to build an assurance ecosystem that is thinking about both technical and socio-technical impacts.
Thank you. And then kind of switching sides in a sense, a question I had for Sharon was, IBM is obviously one of the, is a big vendor of AI-based technologies and tools, and you supply the public sector, the private sector, and some of these solutions are technologically very advanced and novel. So from a supplier point of view, have you seen AI assurance become an issue that comes up in conversations with clients and customers? Is there a new set of expectations that people have? And what are those? And does that does that kind of maybe challenge the ways in which the company would traditionally work, or does it require creating new capabilities? So what does it feel like at the coalface?
There's so many different things to point out in there. So I would say there's a real mix, and my impression, my experience, and my experience outside of IBM as well through things like PCS, is that a lot of this is being led much more by technology organizations, not necessarily just the IBMs, although I'd love to think that we are, but not just the IBMs, but often it is being, and we are the ones potentially, often, not always, who might be more cautious and might be trying to educate sounds a little bit patronizing, so I'm not conscious of being recorded, but make sure that everyone is being informed about what's happening and what the outcomes are. As an industry, I think technology or technologist organizations are often leading. I don't mean we're the only ones leading, and it's great to have organizations like CDEI actually help hold everybody to account for what's going ahead. In terms of organisations and really being specific about assurance, I'm not sure they know what they want. And which is partly why organisations like IBM's and many others will be thinking, right, how do we do something that's that's more successful together? Ethics boards and those kind of organisations being set up to make sure that things are reviewed that we're doing. I mean, I've written an article for a publication that's not due out till November or something like that, but that's gone, even that little I think it's 1,000 words, even that's gone to our global AI ethics board to make sure that what we're saying is not something that's controversial, that IBM feels like they can stand behind. So I think we want to protect ourselves as well as our customers. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but there's a variety of experience and education and understanding out there. I think it's largely being led by technology organisations, hopefully being held to account more by organisations like CDEI, and we're all in this together working it out through.
So I guess, and this kind of matches also what Nuala was saying, in the sense that quite often it's actually the technology organisations who want to do the assurance. And it's about that dialogue of how you then gauge the expectations that society and customers have, but also these are evolving because we're not talking about a technology that everybody knows and is skilled in. So I think there is also a big educational and skills piece there.
Yeah, and one of the things that I have observed within our organisation is I think I'm seeing our IBM's research organisation, which is a huge organisation, working much more closely with those of us who are outselling and building and delivering than we ever have before, because everything is changing so quickly, and we have to make sure that we are all joined up as much as we possibly can be to protect ourselves and protect people that are around us as well. So I'm not necessarily just talking about liability and all that kind of thing, but actually to make sure that we are all being better. And I tend to, it was in my bio as well, I tend to look, how can we all be better at what we do? And I think we've got a real purpose behind it. But I'm always going to be very pro IBM, but it's not just us, right? We can see it with other technology organisations as well, doing the same sort of things. I'm sure Rob will be saying the same sort of thing.
Thank you. Turning now to Tom and government. So in other areas, in governments, typically there are elaborate, complex procurement frameworks for all kinds of things, and governments, of course, have complex public duties and complex legal frameworks to apply. Some people suggest that it might be challenging to adapt these sorts of frameworks to new technologies like AI. In roles like yours, I presume part of the job is to advise other parts of government and to help them think about how they could adopt these sorts of technologies. And where do you see, we've heard kind of an industry view, where do you see the priorities in terms of what is needed from industry to enable or accelerate that adoption where it makes sense, or to even help people understand whether they should be using AI in government?
I think it's an excellent question, and much, in line with what Sharon was saying, a lot of it is working together, more as a team than adversaries across a commercial relationship. But of course, in practice, there does need to be some structure to the commercial relationship, and that will in part be through procurement rules, which do have to adapt, but maybe adapt to be more flexible and less specific around those arrangements. I think transparency is very important in all of this, and although it could be unreasonable to expect particularly smaller organisations to be transparent to the point of publishing their code, if that is, of course, the source of the value that they offer. There are probably big steps that could be taken on the commercial side of things to sharing how something is being done. So, for example, we, through the Scottish AI Alliance, recently published an AI register for the Scottish Government, in which we try to outline different use cases of AI across the Scottish public sector. And that, of course, doesn't need to go into the minute details of how solutions work, but it needs to outline them in enough detail that the public can get a fair sense of what's being done with their data. Now, obviously, it's not beholden on the companies themselves to put all of that information in, but they need to be able to support their customers in government to make sure that that record is a fair account of what is being done with data and what data is being used. There are other details as well, I think, around the way government interacts with commercial partners that could improve to help with the use of AI. So that could be the way that partners who are managing data systems allow government to access that data for other purposes. And historically, there have been major problems in government with government not really having control of its own data. And of course, it's on government to make sure that its procurement templates have clear provision for how data should be managed. But through making sure that data can be repurposed, there are going to be more opportunities to enjoy the benefits of AI. And then in the very nature of commercial relationships, I've seen in my own experience of data science particularly, but I think a lot of digital projects that a traditional commercial relationship of a very tightly specified, possibly over-specified service to be delivered by a commercial provider often doesn't give the flexibility to adapt as an understanding of the actual user needs in a situation evolve, or in a data science context, an understanding of what lies in the data, what patterns could be used in order to predict something for an improved public service. And so starting to, on both sides of the relationship, explore commercial models that allow a bit more flexibility and interaction between the end users of an AI service and the providers of that AI service. So for example, models along the lines of managed capacity rather than a managed service. All of these things could start to move in a direction of government and industry working much more as a team to develop AI solutions.
And just to follow up on the register, is there any example that comes to mind from a service, AI-based service that we already have in Scotland?
So a recent freedom of information request that we responded to has prompted, because I mean the AI register was only quite recently made public, but we were prompted by an FOI request to make sure that we were reasonably exhaustively, probably shouldn't say reasonably, fully exhaustively, as a statutory duty, to get a sense of what AI projects were out there. So there were about 40 AI projects that came back from that research, and you know, with a variety of different areas. I feel it's probably best for me to plug the one that we ourselves issued quite recently, which was through the Scottish Government's CivTech commercial mechanism, which I'd say deserves attention in its own right as a way for governments and industry to interact, particularly on innovation projects. We commissioned a chatbot essentially to help with people with disabilities engage with public services.
And I think it's also important to highlight those sorts of examples, because people typically think of areas where it's very much about kind of controlling or, you know, maybe even restricting access to public services, and people sometimes don't see what new things can be unlocked through AI, for example, for inclusion. Thank you. And Rob, I think one thing that we're seeing, especially also in the context of the big kind of generative AI systems, and some of those are very kind of general purpose, and then there's a whole supply chain that is building on those generic tools and then creating bespoke, specific applications. But that's just one example. Generally, in these systems, you often have multiple developer and supplier organizations involved in a single product. And I suspect that in an organization like BT, you both develop some of these systems in-house, but you will also use others that come from other vendors. Do you think AI creates new challenges in terms of how we think about responsibility, accountability, liability in IT development and procurement? Or are people maybe exaggerating that, and it's not actually that different from other types of complex IT systems?
Yeah, I think it's tempting, given the seeming pace of change and all the activity that's going on at the moment, to think it's everything's been thrown in the air and it's new. But I think when you let the dust settle a little bit and step back, a lot is still the same. I think the foundations, in terms of how you go about procuring AI and bringing it into organisation, I think the kinds of risks that you're exposed to, or the things that you should care about, are very similar to those that we've known before. Like when you go and buy a product, you procure a product, you want to know that it's been built to a certain standard, or it's not going to catch fire when you plug it in, and those sorts of things. So, and so the fundamentals, I don't think they've changed. I think what's different and perhaps worrying for people is they don't know how to do the specifics What are the new questions that I need to ask about this technology, or where are the gaps in my knowledge that are going to allow something to kind of sneak through and cause an accident later on? So, for example, if you don't know, if you're not a domain expert in AI and you don't really understand how models get built and trained, you might not be alive to the fact that, you know, big models require lots of data. Someone has to curate that data, someone has to label it, and some of the practices that go on in that space are dubious, to say the least. And so, you know, you might have a really good handle on an ethical supply chain in a more traditional IT context and be very much blind to what could happen in the AI machine learning space. And I think similar sorts of issues arise around issues that Nuala had mentioned, bias and fairness and so on. And I don't think you can't expect a procurement professional to have a handle on all of this. And you know, I don't think they have had in sort of traditional procurement and in the IT space before. So I think what needs to happen is a kind of renewed communication between the different groups of people involved in this space, and an understanding of what kind of knowledge has to be transferred from experts to the people who are at the sort of coalface of actually structuring contracts and going through procurement processes and all those sorts of things. But I think the gap there then is, and again it's back to what Nuala was talking about, which is around an absence, a sort of vacuum of standards and frameworks to reference. Right. So if I care about bias and fairness, well, how you know, at the moment it's a little bit of a free for all. You know, I think it's sort of somewhat analogous to what you see going on in the academic space around people building models and running benchmarks and claiming state-of-the-art performance, where the variety of benchmarks allows an awful lot of wiggle room and makes it very hard to do comparisons and get any sort of consistency. So I think you know, in terms of what needs to change, I think we need to try and fill that vacuum and start creating some of those standards and reference frameworks. We know we're all talking about the same thing. And if I may, I also feel like this is a little bit of a pet thing of mine, is that there's a lack of a vocabulary, or at least I haven't found it yet, right, around this space, about how to talk about risk. Or the kinds of issues that might arise in this space. And again, it allows people to have complete freedom in how they describe problems and things. And I wish there was a bit more of a kind of structured vocabulary around how we talk about some of these issues and the problems, because I think then that would allow us to be a bit more nuanced in how we approach things and the kinds of regulation or rules that we put around something. So it's not a one-stop shop. Right, we can be a bit more nuanced and a bit layered and say, you know, in terms of sort of the risks that might arise or the types of applications that we're using. So I think that's another kind of gap for me.
Mm-hmm. So that nicely brings me to the next thing I wanted to ask Sharon, which is around we all want to get the maximum benefit from these new technologies. But then people worry and they think about the risks. And as you say, there is wiggle room, there is maybe not the clarity that people would like to see if they adopt a new technology. And there are very specific things that people are talking about in AI: bias and discrimination, the inability of some systems to provide explanations for their decisions, challenges around how the behavior of systems changes over time. And then broader concerns around privacy, surveillance, respect for human rights, and so on. Do you see that this is keeping organizations, these worries are keeping organizations from embracing AI, or does it lead them to kind of just focus on use cases or application areas where it's less risky, or are we seeing actually progress being made on people getting the assurances they need and then being willing to take that step forward?
I'm a technologist, so the answer is always it depends. I would say actually a lot of the worry came after a lot of people actually trying and experimenting, if that makes sense. So if anyone's ever designed any kind of technology system, it has always been that people forget about security until the end. They're like, oh, did we make it secure? And now it's like, did we make it, you know, ethical? Did we make it responsible, trustworthy? And all those other kind of robust and all those other words, and we're kind of doing that at the end. So I think I have seen that there's been a lot where people have gone out and tried things across industries. I'm not thinking just particularly about government or one or another at the moment. I've gone and tried things, and then afterwards, oh, we need to think about this other stuff too. So I think some of that has kind of happened in that order, but has then made people think, oh, well, maybe I need to take a step back here. Maybe I do now need to think a bit more about it. We've got some organisations, government organisations, that the first thing they've started with us is what is their ML ops, right? So how are they going to make sure, as much as they can, within the lack of standards and all that kind of thing, be able to explain what's happening, be able to give clarity round about where there may be bias and those things. So they actually started with that as a foundation, so that they can therefore build AI that they feel they have more confidence in, more trust in, and potentially have some more assurance in as well. So there is an element where maybe people have tried and then maybe pulled back a little bit. It's been really interesting to watch when with all the ChatGPT stuff, all the reactions. There were certainly a number of government folks, and then maybe you'll speak to them. They won't necessarily have said it publicly, but oh no, we're not touching it yet, just not. And you know, that's fair. That's a fair response. It's maybe a knee-jerk reaction, but you know, trust is so important, and it's so important if you're government. It's so important that really you can't risk it. But then you'll get folks like NatWest who have been working on things like their virtual assistants for such a long time. Have actually been helping organisations like IBM develop that technology in a way that actually is very trusted, and they have assurance in it. So it's a life cycle. We will always be getting better at it, I think, and that language that Rob's talked about I think some of that will come as we work together and evolve. In some areas, participants, particularly government, have to be really careful about that trust and what they do about it. But I'm not seeing that being a prohibitor to trying and experimentation. I think other things might be an inhibitor, having the right kind of data, having enough of the data, having the permission to use the data, and all those other basics that actually you need before you can do something that's useful with it as well.
So it's great to hear that optimism, and I'm sort of hearing also that overall we're making progress. Even if we don't really have a readily accessible general assurance ecosystem that everybody can just simply access, as Rob was painting out. So Tom, I wanted to ask you, can you think of an example where the use of AI in government is being either already happening or is being considered, and which kind of demonstrates how ready or not government might be to answer all these questions. Of course, we're focusing a bit on government here because that's what, you know, but I suspect it's interesting I guess it's interesting for people to hear kind of concrete examples.
And I mean, I'd refer for more concrete examples besides the one I've mentioned to the AI register, which is available online. And I don't think we'd want to pretend that we're in a conclusive position for any of this. But as part of the AI register, we are exploring risk assessment tools through which users of the register can work with their commercial partners to make sure that not only have they satisfied our requirements for understanding risk, but that we've maybe addressed some of those concerns that potential users of AI or suppliers of AI might have about particular courses of action, by helping them adopt a standard approach to detailing and identifying mitigations for all of those risks. And I know at a UK level as well, there's work going on to make sure that risks are well managed across all the potential uses of AI. For example, Crown Commercial Service, I think, are looking at mechanisms, potentially compliance with the BSI's ISO 42001, which is in development, I think, still, as ways to standardise and help make that process of exploring the risks a bit more systematic and a bit easier to engage with for commercial partners.
Mm-hmm. And so if, for example, I mean, I suppose one difficulty is also there are so many different types of services you could develop with AI. How do you think the risk or concerns comes into the prioritization process that is probably otherwise driven by policy objectives, policy priorities? So if I'm thinking, we could probably build something to, I don't know, do more automated triage of people in the NHS, where of course we know that there's a big public service issue around how health services and social care are delivered. But I guess there's a balance to be struck between how risky might it be, how much would we know what we're doing or what might happen, and how important is the policy objective?
No, absolutely, and I mean risk management processes across government are always improving and becoming more formalised and structured. So I think it would be reasonable to expect beyond just AI to see risk playing even more of a role in the initial prioritisation of different activities. Of course, when the risk we're talking about are tied up in ethics and public perception of the uses of AI, we get into the very complicated interplay between ethics and legislation. How do you differentiate what is right from what has been worked out as right in a legal sense through the very well-established mechanisms we have developed over centuries for getting a lot of different people with different views of what's right to agree what's right. And I think there do need to be technical innovations there. I think Nuala's, the grant that's been proposed on fairness, as well as a whole number of different exercises that the Scottish Government are pursuing to build participation mechanisms that could be used around ethics for AI, for data sharing and so on, offer opportunities for us to try and innovate there, so that alongside those historic mechanisms for establishing in the long term what is right, we have more tools available to help us understand what is right, what is fair, on a faster basis, so that could realistically feed into the prioritisation of projects, rather than it being a sort of consideration down the line after projects have gotten to a certain momentum.
Very interesting. So maybe in the end also the governance mechanisms themselves might adapt. Yes. Thank you. Now, to switch gears completely, as a technical person, I'm sort of also thinking about the people working in the technology organizations and their day-to-day work. And one thing I wanted to ask you, Rob, was what, if anything, is changing for developers and for the development process, especially in kind of R&D heavy organizations. For example, I could imagine that they're called upon more often to measure, benchmark, document, or test systems rather than do another experiment with another prototype and see whether it gets the required performance. So do you think do you see those roles changing? Is the mix changing? Are maybe also the attitudes and cultures shifting?
I think there are some new things that people are increasingly going to find themselves being asked to do. I think the core is much the same, but I think there are. You can start to see in some areas some responsibilities kind of landing on the developer, and perhaps inappropriately, right, or without the right support and the frameworks to guide that. So one example I think is around bias and fairness, for example. So there's there's at least 100 different ways of or sort of metrics for measuring fairness and bias. And it strikes me the very existence of those just makes it feel like a technology problem. Right? So it's natural then, as a model or a system is being developed, to say, well, okay, this issue of testing whether the system is fair or mitigating it if it turns out we think we've got a problem falls on the developer community, which I think is a problem, right? Because I don't think that community by and large is qualified to make a lot of the choices that should be made. I think that particular area starts at the top of the company in terms of its values, right? Its principles and how it wants to express those. And then the question of how that's implemented might fall to the developer, but they need to be guided by what the company considers is right. You know, which metrics would you apply, right? Are you interested in group fairness? Are you interested in individual fairness? Where are you going to draw a line? What threshold do you set? You can't leave those sorts of decisions to someone whose sort of day job is basically coding the model and doing the testing. So I think that is a problem, and perhaps, you know, we need to think about where the responsibilities are and make sure we haven't got people being, you know, we're not delegating stuff to different groups inappropriately. In the work we did in the TM forum, quite early on, we came up with this concept, which I think is quite helpful in this sense. We called it the model warranty. So it's a bit like a software warranty or warranty that you get with a product. And really that was a device both to get people to sort of think about how to document what has been done, right? So that when we transmit it onwards, people will know how to use it. But it was also a device for making explicit some of the limitations that might be in place, so that the people who built the system had a way of communicating into the future to say, don't use it like that, or it's safe to use like this, but as long as it's within this sort of these sets of constraints. And I think that kind of thinking about how to communicate to our future selves and to our colleagues or other end users is going to be really important. And I think, so another aspect of what might change for developers is how they document systems, how they think about communicating into the future. Because I think a key thing for me around AI and ML is that we don't decouple the kind of the user instructions from the model, the instantiation of it. Because there's just so many ways to abuse something once it's been sort of sent downstream and sort of chucked over the fence, often accidentally, not maliciously, just by not understanding how it was built and what the purpose was for. You see a lot of mission creep going on, and I think that's really dangerous. So I think a sort of more emphasis now in that developer community on making sure that the sort of recognition that it's a living thing that you've created, and you need to care about how it's going to be looked after into the future. So I think that will change a lot about how we sort of think about documenting systems and managing them.
Yeah, that certainly resonates with a lot of conversations I've had with industry quite often, with the customers, the organizations that procure these systems, that quite often they ask a lot of technical questions around these risks, but it's hard to understand what exactly they want in terms of what sorts of guarantees they want to subscribe to themselves. So I think, thank you all very much. I think we've managed to draw a picture, or you have managed to draw a picture, for me at least, that is a bit of a kind of a puzzle where you've got lots of different pieces that go all the way from what the developers do, what the risk management and procurement frameworks look like, how the evolutionary process of working with the customer and developing, almost kind of co-designing and co-developing the process might go. So just to finish, I want to go back to Nuala, who's been who I asked the first question to, and to sort of come back to that and think about if we all agree that AI assurance requires close collaboration between industry, academia, government, other players, regulators, standard bodies, international organizations even, and so on, as we think about the global issues. Is there a risk that might just lead us to surface ever new problems and challenges or are we seeing, is there a trajectory where we're seeing more cohesion, more integration of different viewpoints, and kind of actually, at some point also probably more making things simpler for those who need to solve their problem?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think kind of is like the too many cooks question. You bring so many people into the room, is it just making things more complicated? I think I would really echo what Rob was saying earlier about the importance of kind of making sure there's diverse perspectives in the room, particularly because there's so many different knowledge and skill sets that are required. And as you say, you might have ethics experts who don't know very much about the machine learning kind of implications. So at CDI, we have a really big role as a convener to bring these groups together. We think it's absolutely essential that you have these different groups in the room. I think it can bring challenges. It can surface kind of more questions and problems maybe now, but addressing those things now is so much more important and efficient than kind of having one group drive this forward and in 10 years encountering these questions. And I guess I wanted to highlight, I think, some of the things that we think about in bringing the different groups into the room. But firstly, academia, that's where we're seeing some of the most kind of cutting edge R&D around assurance techniques, particularly around the socio-technical aspects. There's some really interesting work happening in academia, and they don't necessarily get to kind of test that so practically. So bringing them into the room is really, really important. But including industry, we find is important to ensure that we're not being overly burdensome, we are being proportionate, we're developing assurance that isn't then asking somebody to do, 2 months extra work that they can't do if they're a startup or an SME. So how do we make sure they're actually able to engage in a meaningful way? We think it's really important to bring the regulators into the room to ensure that the solutions we're coming up with are fit for purpose. And I think with AI, it's really interesting because the regulators that we're looking at are sector regulators. So they have expertise with their kind of sectoral regulation that exists, but how does that interact with any new regulation that will come up around AI, and how do those kind of fit together? Making sure they're in the room to help answer those questions is essential. And then I think also thinking about ED&I groups, because there's a lot of kind of underrepresented communities that face a lot of different risks, and if they're not part of these conversations, those might not be surfaced yet, or we might not identify opportunities or times where we probably shouldn't be using AI, and it's important to have somebody in the room to kind of advocate for that. So yeah, we think it's really important to kind of get all these people together. In terms of where we're coming to in concrete solutions, I think that could be potentially misleading, and that we don't think there's going to be kind of one assurance framework that people can drive forward. It's so context specific. You really need to kind of adapt the solutions and the techniques that you're using. But I do think there's more coherence in kind of developing a suite of resources. So we're seeing, like, the AI Standards Hub came out last year, which is this online observatory that has all the relevant AI standards and kind of brings all of this knowledge into one place for people. We've seen the OECD catalogue of tools and metrics for trustworthy AI, which has 200 or 300 now tools and metrics that people can reference, and again is this kind of like one-stop shop for information that people can go to. We've seen the NIST risk management framework, which is coming from the States, which is kind of starting to work through some of the OECD principles in practice. So there's more resources and kind of, yeah, one-stop shop is the best word I can think of, but places where people can go to get all of this information. I think because people are having these collaborative conversations and working together to develop these resources, that's been really positive. But one kind of complexity that I will highlight, and this actually comes back to something Rob said as well, is around actually terminology and vocabulary. So having all of these different people in the room, we're seeing that people are talking about these things that tend to be very similar in very different ways, using very different words. So even today, we're calling this the AI Assurance Roadshow workshop. We call this AI Assurance at CDI. But when we speak to our US colleagues, they don't know what that means. They talk about risk management. And when we speak to European colleagues, they talk about AI quality. And people talk about responsible AI, trustworthy AI, ethical AI. Is that all the same? So we don't really have that common language, and that is really difficult. But to flag, we are working on a project around this. So we're thinking more about terminology, taxonomy, ontology. How does AI governance relate to AI assurance? How does that relate to responsible AI? If you're talking about one thing in the UK, what's the equivalent if you're looking to the US or Australia or Canada? So trying to bring all of this information again into one place and have this kind of mapping, just to make sure that we're really kind of contextualizing the conversation and using a common language, I think is really the next step.
And maybe, you will advise our government to promote that sort of international
absolutely.
internationally at the upcoming AI Summit, just to close the loop from where Shakeel started. Thank you very much. We're kind of out of time, but unless Shakeel and Will look at me very grimly, I will open this up for some questions from the audience. If you would like to ask any of our panelists any questions, or if you have any comments. Yes?
So I'm an entrepreneur, and sort of regulation makes me sort of cold. But I'm an entrepreneur in digital health, so regulation is my bread and butter, and it's important. What worries, I think one of the risks is that particularly if you're doing what we're doing, we're running clinical trial at the end of the year, we're doing a chance, very focused on what we're doing, the cohort of people that we're working with, what we're trying to achieve. So what we can do, the resource plot is quite small. And my worry is that sort of maybe regulatory approach leaves the people who are already excluded out in the cold, not able to access, or currently not able to access the services they need, whether because they're waiting lists are too long or they live in a socioeconomic and poor background. There's people who could be helped by AI tools and by digital health to have access to the knowledge and the self-help that could support them. Won't get it because we're so busy worrying about regulation and safety that we're making what's possible really tiny rather than being innovative and making things open and doing things that I would want to do as an entrepreneur. So my question is that, how do you square that circle of being safe, having regulation, and not just exclude the innovation that allows accessibility?
Thank you.
Yeah,
Anybody want to take that?
I can try to take that. So I would say the UK's proposed approach, we published a white paper in March, and the title of the white paper is a pro-innovation approach to AI regulation. So right now it's proposed voluntary principles, and it's 5 principles which are kind of outcomes that a system should achieve. So a system should be safe, secure, robust, fair, transparent, explainable, etc., etc. But the point is that the white paper doesn't define what you need to do to comply with that. The sector regulators who are experts in those sectors, so for healthcare like the MHRA, for example, would work through what kind of safety, security, fairness means in a healthcare context, and then would be responsible for kind of measuring or checking compliance or alignment with that. But the regulation is purposely not overly prescriptive, particularly because AI, and as we've seen with kind of LLMs and foundation models, it's evolving so quickly. We don't want to say something super, super specific that in 6 months is going to be outdated. So the regulation has been designed with that in mind. In terms of kind of excluding groups that are historically excluded, I think that's something that is a huge problem in the world, but with AI especially, which has a risk of kind of perpetuating existing biases. And we've done a lot of work around kind of access to demographic data to evaluate kind of fairness and inclusion of systems, because if the data sample that you have is kind of representative of historic data where certain groups don't have access to healthcare in the same way for whatever reasons, they will continue to be excluded. So how can you use different kind of data access solutions to try to bring them in, whether that be kind of proxies, which have their own issues, or trying to kind of create more representative data samples. I think that's a really important issue, but I don't think that necessarily the proposed regulation is going to negatively impact that. I think we're aware that we don't want to stifle innovation, and there's lots of kind of solutions around data access that people are looking to try to ensure that the AI systems that are being created are not going to perpetuate existing biases. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Thank you. There was another question here.
Yeah, so I just wondered to what extent you think the procurement processes will not be fit for purpose in terms of, I think things are getting rolled out as add-ins, as plugins, as they're not coming along necessarily saying we are AI. So how do you, are things going to get in via the back door without getting caught?
Is there, so I don't know who has a perspective on this.
I think the answer is yes. I think it's kind of inevitable. Certainly my experience has been recently that you see a lot of vendors coming along saying, this is my solution and it's got AI. Right? And it's hard to tell whether it has or not, right? Because there's a lot of hype, so people are trying to ride a sort of wave, and they'll position a product as having some sort of AI component on it because they think that makes it more attractive. I suspect that kind of behaviour might stop soon or reduce, because as soon as there are further obligations as a result of claiming that something is AI, then people are maybe going to be, would hope to be a bit clearer about what's going on. But yeah, I think it's complicated because, as you say, things don't usually come along as, you know, badged. It's entirely AI. It will be a system. It will be a lot of components, and so inevitably things are going to sneak through that maybe should have been evaluated in some way or subject to some processes that they don't. I don't really know what a good solution. I'm not a sort of expert in the procurement area by any means, but my sense is that a first step is education, right? So in my own organisation, I've been involved in doing some of this with different teams across the business, where you've got groups of people who are typically working with vendors or potential partners, and they're evaluating their technology, thinking, can we use it, can we resell it, and so on. And what we've seen there is increasingly those people coming to us saying, help, right? We've realised that there's a significant AI component to this product, and we don't understand it. We don't understand what questions to ask. We don't understand what kind of things we should be worried about and what the risks are. So part of my job has been to help sort of build up material and educate those people, so that they're never going to be domain experts, but at least we can help them do due diligence. So we produced material, for example, where it is literally a sort of due diligence checklist, if you like, for that we can share with our colleagues and say, look, if you don't know what to ask, at least ask these questions, right? And that will get the conversation going. Here's some guidance about what you should expect in terms of responses. And if you're not getting a good feeling from that, then you can start to involve some of the more expert people to get involved in the conversation, should that be required. So I think there's a kind of bootstrapping kind of thing, or layered approach, that's going to have to go on until we've kind of understood how to kind of defend against stuff, if you like, sneaking through.
Thank you.
Our students do quite technical projects, but nothing at the scale of socio-technical impact that we're actually worried about. So when they go into the workplace, they're not really prepared to put some of these things into practice. And what they have heard about is things in the immediate, things that can go wrong, or things that could have a lot of potential. And I wondered, how does induction work to make new employees realistic about this and not get disillusioned, actually, and see how the corporate pitch of come work for us, we do these great things, and actually see their place in this when they know there are risks as well. And beyond that, is there more that universities training could do to prepare students better for really what their place is going into this? I'm curious if there are.
It would be wrong of me to try and speak on behalf of all organisations in their induction processes. I can say that from an IBM perspective, I think we're pretty good at, actually for everyone, right, not just new hires, continually educating on all sorts of topics, including things like what fairness might be and that kind of thing, and inclusion and all sorts. And there are a lot of organisations in industry that will be doing that, and it is going to depend on how big the organisation is and who owns it and how diverse they are in terms of their makeup and that kind of thing. I'm going to do a little plug here for BCS. Didn't really mean to, but the Chartered Institute for IT. I would encourage students to be members. They can join that way because there's a wealth of information out there through that institute to be able to understand a bit more about some of the more real life experiences that you have once you get into a non-academic workplace, shall we say. That might be something for students to consider as well. And I'm sure there'd be folks from BCS who'd be very happy to come in and speak about these kind of things as well, and just share experiences of real life and actually what's really exciting, as well as some things to be a bit cautious about.
I was just to pick up on that. I think my experience is that people coming out of universities today are relatively ill prepared. Not just in terms of things like AI regulation, insurance that we're talking about today, but just the reality of doing like data science work. So I think it's quite a culture shock at the moment. You know, the kinds of problems or the way that they've been taught doesn't help them, and this is my limited experience, doesn't help them understand what it's going to be like in an organisation. You know, the kind of the challenges aren't about how to build the model, typically. They're all of the peripheral stuff that you thought someone else was going to take care of, like defining the problem properly, finding some data that we can use, sort of going through all of the organisational bureaucracy to allow that to happen and to create a space that's safe where you can do that work. There's a whole ton of stuff that they're just like, wow, I didn't know I was going to have to do that. In our organisation, for I can't remember how many years, nearly 10 years I think now, we've run an annual data science course, and so that's been aimed at people who want to transition into that workspace, so maybe they've been in the company a long time, but also it's a place where we can bring through a lot of the graduates and new entrants into the organisation and expose them to a whole kind of range of you know, both sort of educational material in terms of technical material, but also in terms of doing the work, doing the job inside the company. And that's proved to be a good way of sort of upskilling or helping people come to terms with the reality. I think we typically put over 100 people now each year. We run it as a week's course and take people through that. So several hundred people have gone through that. But it's only really by doing things like that that you can help kind of make that transition. So, but I think there's a lot more to do in terms of industry and academia working together to try and make that a slightly smoother journey. So I think there's probably some conversations to be had to see what would be possible there.
Thank you. I'm sure there's more questions, but I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there to move on to the next part of the workshop. So please join me in thanking all our panelists today for their wonderful contributions.